Hiroshi scoffed as the janitor approached him in the hallway. No way she understands anything about business, he thought. Sarah picked up the papers from the floor with trembling hands. What came from her lips in perfect Japanese made his expression freeze. Before we get into today's story, let me know where you're watching from. Grab a coffee or get comfortable on the couch. And please don't forget to support us. All you have to do is hit that like button, and I'll know you enjoy this type of story. So ready? Let's begin. The alarm clock went off at 5 in the morning, as always. Sarah opened her eyes in the small apartment she shared with her 12-year-old daughter, Chloe. The familiar sound of rain hitting the window reminded her that another day of work awaited. She got up slowly, trying not to wake the girls sleeping on the living room sofa bed. In the tiny kitchen, she prepared weak coffee and looked at the bills piled up on the table. Chloe's school tuition, the overdue rent, the electricity bill with a shut-off notice. She sighed deeply and drank the bitter coffee, feeling the familiar weight of responsibility on her shoulders. "Mom!" Chloe's sleepy voice made her turn around. The girl was standing in the doorway, her hair messy and her eyes still swollen with sleep. "Go back to sleep, sweetie. It's still early." "Are you leaving for work already?" Chloe came closer and hugged her mother around the waist. "I dreamed we were in Japan again, like in your stories." Sarah felt a pang in her chest. The stories she told her daughter about the time she spent in Japan seemed increasingly distant, as if they belonged to someone else's life, a person she used to be before everything changed. "One day we'll travel there for real," she murmured, kissing the top of her daughter's head. It was a promise she had been making for years, knowing that on her janitor's salary, she could barely cover their basic needs. She arrived at Techno Global Corporation at 6:30. The glass and steel building rose imposingly against the grey morning sky. Sarah swiped her card at the reader and entered through the service entrance, as she always did. The navy blue uniform made her practically invisible to the executives who arrived later in their luxury cars. She began cleaning on the ground floor, moving silently through the gleaming corridors. The Japanese company was known for its strict discipline and well-defined hierarchy. Sarah knew every corner of the building, every office, every meeting room. She had worked there for 3 years, and no one had ever said a word to her other than "excuse me" when they needed to pass. Around 9 in the morning, as she started cleaning the executive floor, she heard agitated voices coming from the main boardroom. Through the glass door, she could see several executives in dark suits gesturing nervously. At the center of the table, a man of about 40 remained motionless, his face expressionless. It was Hiroshi Tanaka, the CEO who had arrived from Japan 6 months earlier. Sarah had observed Tanaka from a distance several times. He was known for his coldness and the way he kept his distance from all employees. He never smiled, never greeted anyone besides the other executives. To him, people like Sarah simply didn't exist. She continued her cleaning, passing by the empty offices while overhearing fragments of the meeting. They were talking about an important contract that had gone wrong, about lost documents, about pressure from the Japanese headquarters. Sarah understood every word, but she kept focused on her work, as she always did. It was almost noon when she finished the floor. She put her cleaning supplies back on the cart and headed for the elevator. Another half shift to go, then she would go home, help Chloe with her homework, and try to find the energy to make dinner with the little she had in the fridge. Life had become this predictable, exhausting routine, but it was what she had, and she needed to be grateful for it. At least she had a job. At least she could support her daughter, even if it was just the basics. She had no idea that in a few hours all of this would change forever. The afternoon was more hectic than usual on the 22nd floor. Sarah was pushing her cleaning cart down the hallway when she noticed Hiroshi Tanaka leaving the boardroom with quick steps. He was carrying a black briefcase under his arm, and holding his phone to his ear, speaking in Japanese, in a clearly irritated tone. Sarah slowed her pace, not wanting to get in the way. She knew that tone of voice well, the restrained frustration, the pressure to solve complex problems quickly. She had heard similar conversations years ago, in another time, another life. Tanaka walked past her without even noticing her presence, as he always did. To him, Sarah was just another piece of the decor, as invisible as the furniture or the plants in the hallways. He continued walking quickly toward the elevator, still talking on the phone. That's when it happened. In his haste, Tanaka stumbled slightly on a small rise in the carpet. The briefcase slipped from under his arm, flew open in the air, and spilled its contents all over the hallway floor. Papers, documents, and photographs scattered in every direction. The CEO stopped abruptly, hung up the phone, and looked at the mess with an expression of absolute frustration. They were important documents. Sarah could tell by the company seal and the confidential markings on several pages. Hiroshi bent down and began to gather the papers with sharp, stressed movements. Sarah hesitated for a moment. Her first instinct was to keep walking, to remain invisible as she always did. But something in her nature couldn't watch someone struggle, even if it was the coldest, most distant CEO she had ever met. She parked her cart and approached. "Can I help?" she said in a low voice. Tanaka looked up for a fraction of a second, seemed not to fully register her presence, and went back to picking up the papers. Sarah knelt on the floor and began to gather the documents that were farther away. It was then that her eyes fixed on one of the pages. It was a technical report on electronic components, full of specific terms and complex diagrams. But that wasn't what caught her attention. It was the header in Japanese, and just below it a handwritten note that made her heart race. The note was clearly wrong. It was an incorrect translation that could cause serious problems in communication with the Japanese headquarters. Sarah knew this because she understood every character written there perfectly. She looked at Tanaka, who was still gathering papers without paying attention to her. She could simply hand him the documents and walk away. It was what she was supposed to do. It was what she always did. But Chloe needed a better future, and maybe, just maybe, this was an opportunity. "Excuse me," Sarah said, holding the papers out to him, "but I think there's a mistake in this translation." Hiroshi finally looked directly at her, a confused expression on his face. "What do you mean?" Sarah took a deep breath. It was now or never. "This note in Japanese is translated incorrectly. What's written here could cause a major misunderstanding with your suppliers in Osaka." Tanaka's expression changed completely. He stopped gathering papers and stared at her with his full attention for the first time. You read Japanese?" "Yes," Sarah replied, feeling her hands tremble slightly. "And this translation could cost the company a lot of money if it's sent this way." Hiroshi took the paper from her hands and read it again, now with renewed attention. Sarah could see the exact moment he realized she was right. His eyes widened slightly, and he looked at her as if he were seeing her for the first time. "Are you sure about this?" he asked, his voice filled with a mix of surprise and urgency. "I am," Sarah answered firmly. "The difference is subtle, but it completely changes the meaning of the technical specification." Tanaka was silent for a long moment, still staring at her. The hallway around them remained empty, but Sarah felt as if the whole world were watching that moment. Hiroshi Tanaka stood up slowly, still holding the document. His eyes shifted between the paper and Sarah, as if trying to process what had just happened. For a moment, the hallway was completely silent, only the muffled hum of the air conditioning filling the space between them. "You said Osaka specifically," he murmured, more to himself than to her. "How do you know this document is for our suppliers in Osaka?" Sarah felt a knot in her stomach. She had revealed more than she intended. I overheard you talking about problems with Japanese suppliers, and from the type of translation error, it seemed to be about electronic components. Tanaka studied her for a few more seconds. Then, surprisingly, he knelt on the floor beside her and helped finish gathering the remaining papers. It was the first time Sarah had seen the CEO do something so human. "What's your name?" he asked, organizing the documents in the briefcase. "Sarah Miller." "Sarah," he repeated, as if testing the sound. "How long have you worked here?" 3 years. "And how long have you spoken Japanese?" Sarah hesitated. It was the question she dreaded, because the answer would bring more questions, and more questions meant having to explain things she preferred to keep buried in the past. "A few years," she answered vaguely. Hiroshi closed the briefcase and stood up, offering a hand to help her up as well. Sarah accepted, surprised by the gesture. When she was on her feet, he didn't let go of her hand right away. "This incorrect translation," he said, "if it had been sent this way, would have cost the company about $2 million in rework and production delays." Sarah felt her legs go weak. $2 million. It was more money than she could even imagine. "I need to know," Tanaka continued, how you learned Japanese well enough to spot an error that our own professional translators missed." The question hung in the air like a gentle accusation. Sarah looked down at her worn-out shoes, then at the cleaning cart waiting patiently in the hallway, her entire current life summarized in those simple, practical objects. "I studied in Japan," she finally said, her voice almost a whisper. "I lived there for 3 years. Studied what?" "International relations and Japanese studies at the University of Tokyo." Hiroshi's expression changed completely. Sarah could see confusion, surprise, and something that looked like recognition flash across his face. "The University of Tokyo," he repeated slowly, "one of the most prestigious in the world. And you're here." "Cleaning floors?" Sarah finished, trying to keep her voice steady. "Yes, life sometimes takes different turns than we plan." Hiroshi was silent for a long moment. Sarah could practically hear his thoughts rearranging themselves. Finally, he spoke. "I need to verify this translation urgently. Could you come with me to my office? There are other documents that might need to be reviewed." Sarah glanced at her cleaning cart, then at the clock on the wall. She still had 2 hours of her shift left. "I can't leave my work," she said. "My supervisor." "I'll talk to your supervisor," Hiroshi interrupted. "This is important, very important." Sarah felt her heart race. Part of her wanted to accept immediately. It was a chance to use her real skills, to be seen as more than just the cleaning lady. But the practical part, the part that had learned to be cautious after so many disappointments, made her hesitate. "I don't know if that's a good idea," she said. Hiroshi looked her directly in the eye. "Sarah, you just saved my company from a very expensive mistake. The least I can do is hear what else you have to say." Hiroshi Tanaka's office was exactly as Sarah had imagined, minimalist, organized, and intimidating. Large windows offered a panoramic view of the city, and the gleaming mahogany desk was perfectly tidy, with only a few documents lined up with military precision. Sarah felt completely out of place there, still in her blue janitor's uniform, nervously clutching a cleaning cloth she had forgotten to leave on her cart. Hiroshi, on the other hand, seemed to be in his natural element, moving around the office with the confidence of someone accustomed to making important decisions. "Please, have a seat," he said, pointing to one of the chairs in front of the desk. Sarah hesitated before sitting, worried she might soil the light upholstery with her work uniform. Hiroshi settled in behind the desk and opened the briefcase they had collected in the hallway. He took out the problematic document and placed it between them. "Show me exactly where the error is," he requested. Sarah leaned forward and pointed to the specific line. "Here, The translator used kikai when they should have used sochi. Both words can mean device, but kikai refers to mechanical machines, while sochi is for electronic devices. For a supplier that produces sensitive electronic components, that difference is crucial. Hiroshi followed her explanation, reading carefully. And that would change the entire production specification, he murmured. Exactly. They would produce the wrong component, which would delay the whole project by months. Hiroshi leaned back in his chair, studying Sarah with an intensity that made her feel exposed. You didn't learn this in a basic Japanese class. No, Sarah admitted. I lived and worked in Japan. I learned not only the language, but also the business culture, the communication protocols, the nuances that make a difference in international business. What company did you work for there? Sarah hesitated. It was the question she knew was coming, and the answer would make her seem even more out of place in this situation. Yamamoto Electronics. I was an international relations analyst. Hiroshi's eyes widened. Yamamoto Electronics? They're our biggest competitors. They were, Sarah corrected gently. I worked there 15 years ago. Things were different then. What happened? Why did you leave? Sarah looked down at her hands, still clutching the cleaning cloth. It was always hard to tell this part of the story. I got pregnant. The father didn't take responsibility, and my family back in the States needed urgent financial help. I had to come back and your career got left behind, Hiroshi completed with an understanding Sarah hadn't expected. When I got here, I was 8 months pregnant with no professional experience in the US, no network. I needed to work immediately. A cleaning job was what I could find, and it just became my reality. Hiroshi was silent for a long moment. Sarah could see him processing the information, rearranging his perception of her. Finally, he stood up and walked to the window. I have, he said, still looking out, about 20 important documents that need to be reviewed before being sent to Japan. Our official translator is overwhelmed and apparently making costly mistakes. Sarah didn't know where the conversation was going, but she felt her heart speed up. Would you be willing to review them? He turned to face her, not as a janitor, but as a consultant, temporarily, of course. Sarah opened her mouth, but no words came out. It was exactly the kind of opportunity she had dreamed of for years, but it had always seemed impossible. I don't know if I can, she finally said. I have my daughter, my schedule. We can work out something flexible, and obviously you would be compensated appropriately for your specialized knowledge. Sarah felt tears welling in her eyes. After so many years of being invisible, someone was finally recognizing her real skills. Why are you doing this? She asked. Hiroshi returned to his chair. Because you just proved you have exactly what my company needs, and because, he paused, I recognize wasted talent when I see it. Sarah came home that night with her head spinning. Chloe was at the table in the small living room, doing math homework under the yellowish light of the old lamp. When she saw her mother, the girl smiled and ran to hug her. "Mom, how was work today?" Sarah hugged her daughter tightly, still trying to process everything that had happened. How do you explain to a 12-year-old that in one afternoon your entire life might have changed course? It was different, she said, brushing a strand of hair from Chloe's face. Very different. Different how? Sarah sat down next to her daughter at the table. Chloe's schoolbooks were spread out, along with some papers where she had drawn Japanese characters her mother had taught her. You remember those stories I tell about Japan? About when I used to work with companies and translate important documents? Chloe nodded, her eyes shining. You always say that one day you might get to do it again. Today, Sarah said carefully, someone asked me to do exactly that, to use everything I learned in Japan. Chloe's reaction was immediate and enthusiastic. Really? You're going to work with Japanese again. Does that mean we can visit Japan like you always promise? Sarah laughed, but there was a note of caution in her voice. Easy there, sweetie. It was just an offer. I still need to think about everything. But why do you need to think? It's what you've always wanted. It was true. Sarah had spent years dreaming of an opportunity like this. But life had taught her to be realistic, not to get too excited about possibilities that might not pan out. It's complicated, she explained. It would be a different job, with different responsibilities. And I don't know if I could manage it with your school schedule, with our needs. Chloe took her mother's hand. Mom, you're the smartest person I know. If anyone can make it work, it's you. That night, after Chloe had fallen asleep, Sarah sat on the small apartment balcony with a cup of tea. The letter Hiroshi had given her was on the table, an official document offering a temporary consulting position in translation and business relations with Japan. The salary offered was 3 times what she earned as a janitor. With that money, she could pay all the bills on time, maybe even start saving for Chloe's future. But there was more at stake than just money. It was about dignity, about being seen, about using her real skills after years of feeling like she had wasted her entire education and experience. But there were risks too. What if she didn't meet expectations? What if her knowledge was outdated after so many years away from the field? What if it was just a temporary opportunity that would leave her even more frustrated when it ended? Sarah opened the old laptop she sometimes used for Chloe's school research. She browsed a few Japanese news sites and found she could still read and understand everything perfectly. Her Japanese hadn't gotten as rusty as she feared. She found articles about Techno Global Corporation, about its expansion in the American market, about the challenges they faced in communicating with Japanese suppliers. These were exactly the kinds of problems she had helped solve years ago at Yamamoto Electronics. Around midnight, she made her decision. The next day, she called the number Hiroshi had given her and left a simple message. Mr. Tanaka, this is Sarah Miller. I accept your offer. When can I start? There were no guarantees it would work out, but for the first time in 15 years, Sarah felt she was taking a step toward who she really was, not just surviving, but living. The first week as a consultant was a whirlwind of emotions and challenges. Sarah had negotiated a flexible schedule that allowed her to continue with some cleaning duties in the early morning before dedicating herself to the translation work. It was important to keep her source of income secure while she tested this new opportunity. Hiroshi had set up a small office for her on the same executive floor. It was simple, but it had a proper desk, a modern computer, and most importantly, it was a space where she could work with dignity. The first time she sat at that desk, Sarah had to blink several times to make sure she wasn't dreaming. The first documents she received for translation were technical reports on electronic components, exactly her area of expertise from her time at Yamamoto Electronics. As she worked, Sarah realized that not only did her knowledge remain solid, but her life experience had added a valuable perspective to her translations. Are you finding many mistakes in the previous translations? Hiroshi asked during one of their follow-up meetings. Not mistakes exactly, Sarah explained, but cultural inaccuracies that can cause misunderstandings. For example, here, she pointed to a document, the translator used an inappropriate level of formality when addressing senior suppliers. In Japan, that can be interpreted as disrespectful. Hiroshi nodded, clearly impressed. Those nuances are exactly what we've been missing. Our communication with headquarters has improved significantly since you started. But not everything was easy. Sarah felt the curious stares of other employees as she walked through the hallways. Some knew her as the janitor and couldn't hide their surprise at seeing her now working as a consultant. There were whispers and comments that reached her ears. "Did you hear? The cleaning lady is doing translations now. How is that possible? She must have lied about her qualifications. Tanaka is being way too trusting. Anyone can use Google Translate these days." Sarah tried to ignore the comments, but they hurt. She had spent years being invisible, and now she felt overly visible, her every move scrutinized and questioned. It was Chloe who gave her the strength to continue. One evening, as Sarah expressed her doubts about being in the right place, the girl said something that stuck with her. "Mom, remember when you taught me how to ride a bike? You said I had to keep pedaling even when I was scared of falling, because standing still was worse than falling." It was true. Sarah had spent so much time standing still, afraid to try, that she had forgotten how good it felt to move toward her dreams. The real shift began to happen in the second week, when Hiroshi invited her to participate in a video conference with executives from the Japanese headquarters. It was the first time in 15 years that Sarah would be part of an international business meeting. "Are you sure I should be in this meeting?" she asked, adjusting the second-hand blazer she had bought at a thrift store. "I'm sure," Hiroshi replied. "Your perspective will be valuable." The meeting began at 8 in the morning, Tokyo time. Sarah sat beside Hiroshi in the conference room, her heart pounding. On the screen, 3 Japanese executives appeared, all middle-aged men in dark suits. Hiroshi made the introductions in Japanese, explaining Sarah's presence as a specialized consultant in U.S. Japan business relations. Sarah greeted them respectfully in Japanese, using the correct level of formality. What happened next surprised everyone in the room. One of the Japanese executives, apparently the most senior, began asking Sarah direct questions about the specifics of the American market, local regulations, and cultural communication strategies. Sarah answered with confidence, demonstrating not only fluency in the language, but also a deep knowledge of Japanese business protocols. Her previous experience at Yamamoto Electronics became evident as she skillfully navigated the complex issues presented. At the end of the meeting, the senior executive made a comment that changed everything. "Tanaka-san, you've found a treasure. This consultant understands our culture better than many of our own international employees." The Japanese executive's comment echoed through the conference room like an official validation. Sarah felt a mix of pride and relief. Finally, her skills were being recognized by people who truly understood the subject. Hiroshi ended the video conference with a faint smile, something Sarah had rarely seen on his face. "You did exceptionally well," he said, closing his laptop. "They were impressed with your understanding of Japanese negotiation protocols." Sarah was still processing what had just happened. 15 years ago, participating in meetings like this was part of her daily routine. Now, it felt almost surreal to be back in this world. It was gratifying, she admitted. I had forgotten how good it felt to use these skills. In the following weeks, Sarah's reputation grew rapidly within the company. Other departments began to seek her out for help with international communications, and her workload increased significantly. Hiroshi offered to make her temporary position a permanent role as an international relations coordinator. But with success came new challenges. Sarah had to invest in appropriate clothes for meetings, her own laptop to work from home, and personal care she had neglected for years. These were necessary investments, but they consumed a good portion of her new salary. Even harder was dealing with the shift in identity. For 3 years, she had been Sarah, the janitor. Now she was Sarah, the international consultant. The transition wasn't just professional, it was deeply personal. Chloe noticed the change in her mother and, being a perceptive child, made observations that sometimes caught Sarah off guard. "Mom, you're different," she said one night at dinner. "More. Like in your old stories." "What do you mean, sweetie?" "You're talking differently, walking differently, like you're important." Sarah stopped eating. I was always important, Chloe. A job doesn't define who we are. I know, Chloe said with the surprising wisdom of a 12-year-old, but you kind of forgot that for a while, didn't you? It was true. Sarah had started to define herself by the work she did, forgetting her real qualities and skills. The cleaning job had become not just her livelihood, but her entire identity. A month after starting as a consultant, Sarah faced her first major test. The company was negotiating a multi-million-dollar contract with a Japanese conglomerate, and the talks had reached an impasse due to cultural misunderstandings. Hiroshi called her in for an emergency meeting. "They're considering cancelling the contract," he explained, clearly worried. "Something in our proposal offended them, but we can't figure out what it is." Sarah analyzed all the negotiation documents, including exchanged emails and submitted proposals. In less than an hour, she identified the problem. "Here," she said, pointing to a specific section of the proposal. "You used a payment structure that, in Japanese culture, implies distrust. It's as if you're suggesting they might not honor the agreement." Hiroshi read the section several times. "How did this get past all of us?" "Because it's a very specific cultural nuance. In the West, this structure is seen as normal financial prudence. In Japan, it's interpreted as an offense to their business honor." Sarah worked through the night rewriting the proposal, adjusting not just the language, but the entire cultural approach of the document. The next morning, Hiroshi sent the revised version to Japan. The response came in 2 hours. The contract was approved. "Sarah," Hiroshi said that day, "you just saved a $20 million deal." It was in that moment that Sarah realized she had found not just a job, but her place in the world again. 3 months after the incident in the hallway, Sarah could barely recognize her own life. The small apartment had been replaced by a larger place in a better neighborhood. Chloe had her own room for the first time in her life, with a desk where she could study properly. Bills were no longer a source of constant anxiety, but the most significant change had happened within Sarah. She walked the halls of Techno Global with a confidence she hadn't felt in years. Her opinions were sought in important meetings, her insights were valued by the board, and she had become an essential bridge between the American company and its Japanese headquarters. "Mom," Chloe said one night, organizing her new school books, "do you think we can really visit Japan next year?" Sarah smiled. For the first time in 15 years, this wasn't just a distant dream, but a real possibility. "I think so, sweetie. Maybe we can spend the summer vacation there." The relationship between Sarah and Hiroshi had also evolved. The cold, distant CEO she had known had given way to a man who showed genuine appreciation for her work, and at times even shared personal details during their conversations. "You know," he said during one of their weekly meetings, "when I first came to the US, I thought it would be difficult to find people who truly understood our business culture. You proved me wrong. Thank you, Mr. Tanaka. That means a lot coming from you. Please, call me Hiroshi. I think we're past excessive formality." Sarah nodded, but she still felt a little uncomfortable with such familiarity. Hiroshi had been instrumental in her transformation, but she didn't want her gratitude to be misinterpreted. It was on a rainy Friday afternoon that Sarah received a call that would change everything again. It was from Yamamoto Electronics, her former company in Japan. "Miller-san," said the voice on the phone in Japanese, "we've heard about your excellent work at Techno Global. We would like to discuss an opportunity." Sarah nearly dropped the phone. Yamamoto Electronics was one of the largest tech companies in the world, and they were calling her. "An opportunity?" she asked, trying to keep her voice steady. "We are expanding our South American division and need a director of international operations, someone with experience in both our culture and the American market. Your name was suggested by our headquarters." Sarah sat down slowly. It was exactly the kind of position she had dreamed of having 15 years ago, before life took a different turn. Can I think about it? Of course, but we would like an answer in 2 weeks. The position would start next month, based in Chicago. After hanging up, Sarah sat in her office for a long time, staring out the window. It was an incredible opportunity, the kind of role that could change her and Chloe's lives forever. The salary would be even higher, the responsibilities broader, the international prestige immense. But it would mean leaving Techno Global, leaving Hiroshi and the team that had become like a family to her. When Hiroshi found out about the offer, Sarah decided to be transparent with him. His reaction was unexpected. "You should take it," he said without hesitation. "What do you mean?" "Sarah, this is the opportunity of a lifetime. Yamamoto Electronics is much bigger than we are. You'll have a much greater impact there." "But what about here? What about all the work we've built together?" Hiroshi smiled, a genuinely warm expression Sarah rarely saw. "What we built here was giving you the confidence to fly higher. I would be disappointed if you didn't take this chance." That night, Sarah had a long talk with Chloe about the proposal. The girl, with her usual insight, asked the most important question. "Mum, what do you really want? Not what's best on paper, but what will make your heart happy?" It was the question Sarah had been avoiding asking herself. Sarah spent the entire weekend pondering the decision. She walked through familiar places. The park where she used to take Chloe when she was little, the bakery where they bought bread every Sunday, the streets of the neighborhood where they had lived for so many years. Each place held memories of struggle, of overcome hardships, of small victories won day after day. On Monday morning, she arrived at the office early. She wanted to be sure of her decision before talking to Hiroshi. She sat at her desk and looked around the small office that had become so meaningful to her. Here, she had rediscovered not only her professional skills, but also her self-esteem. Hiroshi appeared at her door around 9 o'clock, carrying 2 cups of coffee. "I thought you might want to talk," he said, offering one of the cups. "Thank you." Sarah took the coffee and took a deep breath. "I've made a decision about Yamamoto, and I'm going to decline the offer." Hiroshi nearly dropped his cup. "What? Sarah, are you sure? It's an incredible opportunity." "I'm sure," she said firmly, "and I'll tell you why." Sarah stood up and walked to the window. 15 years ago, I had that same unbridled ambition. I wanted to climb the corporate ladder, make more money, have international prestige. But you know what happened? I got lost in all of it. I forgot what really mattered. She turned to face him. "Here, at Techno Global, I didn't just find a job. I found a place where I can be myself, where I can grow without sacrificing my family, where I can make a difference in a way that makes sense to me." Hiroshi listened in silence, an expression of surprise and something else, perhaps admiration, on his face. "Besides," Sarah continued, "we have important projects here. The expansion into other Latin American countries, the cultural exchange program we're developing. I want to see these things through. But Sarah, the money I make here is already more than enough to give Chloe the education she deserves, and for us to live with dignity. I don't need more than that." Hiroshi came to the window, standing beside her. "Are you sure you're not underestimating your own ambitions?" Sarah smiled. "No, I'm redefining what success means to me. Success isn't just a bigger salary or a higher title. It's about balance, contributing to something meaningful, and being in a place where I can be authentic." "And what if I told you I was planning to promote you to Director of International Relations permanently, with a competitive salary and full autonomy to structure the department as you see fit?" Sarah looked at him, surprised. "You were planning that?" "For weeks. I was just waiting for the right moment to propose it." That afternoon, Sarah called Yamamoto Electronics and politely declined the offer. She explained that at Techno Global she had found an environment where she could contribute significantly while maintaining the work-life balance that was important to her. That evening, when she told Chloe about her decision, the girl hugged her tightly. "I'm proud of you, Mom." "Why, sweetie?" "Because you chose to be happy instead of just trying to impress other people." Sarah realized her daughter had grasped something she was only just beginning to understand herself. Real success wasn't about reaching the top of some hierarchy, but about finding your place in the world, a place where your skills were valued, where you could contribute meaningfully, and where you could be fully yourself. 2 weeks later, Hiroshi officially announced Sarah's promotion. At the small ceremony, he said something she would never forget. "Sarah taught us that sometimes the most valuable people are the ones right under our noses. We just need to have the wisdom to see them." Sarah looked at the small audience of applauding colleagues and felt that she had arrived in the right place, at the right time, being exactly who she was. A year later, Sarah was in her new office, larger, with a view of the city park, reviewing the quarterly reports for the department she had built from scratch. Techno Global had expanded its operations to Chile, Argentina, and Colombia, and much of the success was due to Sarah's expertise in cultural navigation and international communication. Chloe walked into the office carrying her school backpack. It was Friday, and Sarah had negotiated a flexible schedule that sometimes allowed her to pick her daughter up from school. "How was Japanese class today?" Sarah asked, saving the document on her computer. "Sensei Yuki said I'm progressing really fast," Chloe replied with pride, "and that maybe next year I can take the proficiency exam." Sarah smiled. Chloe's Japanese lessons were paid for by the company as part of the cultural development program she had proposed. Hiroshi had enthusiastically supported the idea, seeing the value in training a new generation with international skills. "And you, Mom, still thinking about the trip to Japan?" "Actually," Sarah said, pulling 2 envelopes from her drawer, "I'm not thinking anymore. I'm confirming." She handed the envelopes to Chloe, who opened them quickly. They were 2 plane tickets to Tokyo, dated for the December holidays. Chloe screamed with joy and jumped into her mother's arms. "Really? Are we really going?" "We really are. 3 weeks in Japan. You'll get to see the University of Tokyo, we'll visit Yamamoto Electronics, and you'll get to practice everything you've learned in class." Just then, Hiroshi appeared at the door, smiling at the scene. "Sorry to interrupt the celebration, but I have some news for you." "What news?" Sarah asked. "The Japanese headquarters has approved our proposal for the Cultural Training Center. Sarah, you will have a budget of $2 million to create a program that trains American and Japanese executives in intercultural competencies." It was the project Sarah had worked on tirelessly for the past few months. The idea of creating a center that would prepare professionals for the international market, avoiding the cultural misunderstandings that cost companies millions. "And there's more," Hiroshi continued. "They want you to present the project personally in Tokyo. In fact, they want you to consider spending a few months there supervising the implementation." Sarah looked at Chloe, who was practically vibrating with excitement. "A few months?" Sarah asked. "You could take Chloe with you. She could attend an international school there. It would be an incredible experience for both of you." That night, mother and daughter sat on the balcony of their new apartment, planning not just the 3-week vacation, but the possibility of a longer stay in Japan. This time, it wouldn't be an escape or a desperate search for opportunity. It would be a triumphant return as a recognized and respected professional. "Mom," Chloe said, "do you think if you hadn't dropped those papers in the hallway, none of this would have happened?" Sarah thought for a moment. "I think the opportunities were always there, Chloe. I just needed to be ready to see them and brave enough to seize them. And you're ready now." Sarah looked at her daughter, then at the city lights twinkling below, and finally toward the distant horizon. "Yes," she said with a calm and certain smile. "Now I'm ready for anything."